Hello and welcome back to Moffett Field. If you're tuning in to this video, you've probably seen parts 1 and 2 of the battle for Bryansk, which ended in German defeat, or at least ended in the Germans calling it quits. Because I think, as you'll see in this video, that individual battle wasn't that destructive. In fact, it was pretty equitable. The Allies just had an air advantage. And what I'm going to try to do in this video is step through the kind of numbers behind what was on the board. So how many infantry, how many tanks, how many airplanes, what were the economic cost of those in terms of a base unit, the OSR, what was the unit distribution, air, ground, bombers, fighters, and what was the dice distribution of the various setups on the battle board. So was it set up properly? Did both sides make the right choices in terms of setting up their battle boards? And would things have been different if they had chosen a different setup? And finally, we'll look at the casualties, the OSR values of those, the loss rate for both sides, and I think most importantly, what survived after the battle in terms of the surviving units. And I think that will show why the Axis decided to call it a game. This table shows a way to convert the cost of units, not just in oil, iron, and OSRs, but to create and use the OSR as the common denominator, so that we know that we trade 2 oils for 5 OSRs and vice versa. So that means that 1 oil is equal to 2.5 OSRs, and that 1 iron is equal to 1.7 OSRs because we trade 3 to 5. So if you take the out-of-box costs for, let's take armor for example, it's 1 oil, 2 iron, and 1 OSR. Well, the 1 OSR costs 1 OSR. The 2 iron is 2 times 1.7, so that's 3.3 OSRs. And the oil we know is an exchange rate of 2.5 per oil, and armor costs 1 oil, so that's 2.5 OSRs. If you add all those up, an armor unit costs 6.8 OSRs. Finally, on this table in the upper right are the dice that each unit rolls. So there's the air dice, there's the ground defense stance, and the ground offense stance. Here's a quick reminder of what the units looked like on the board, and then stacked against each other, ready to go on the battle board. So this view shows the Allies on top, the Axis on the bottom. The next column over is the number of units that each side had. So 37 total units on the Allies, 32 total units on the Axis, 21 and 16 ground and air respectively for the Allies, 22 and 10 for the Axis. Using that OSR conversion table that I showed you before, we can see that the Allies have a total kind of net worth of units on the board of 211 versus 166 for the Axis. Moving over again, we can see how those units compare into the regarding the number of dice that those units can roll, depending on if they're fighting air, if they're in the defense mode, or if they're in the offense mode. What the battle board setup section calls out is how those units were actually set up on the battle board. So the Allied infantry were set up 10 in the defense mode. The armor was set up 7 in the defense mode, and the artillery were set up 4 in the offensive mode. And then you can follow down to the airplanes and to the Axis section down below. So they had 976 in the defensive mode for infantry artillery armor, and they had 10 fighters in the air-to-air. So you can either pause the video and study that a little bit, because I'm going to move on to the number of dice that they rolled based upon this setup. So this is the setup of the units we just saw and the number of dice that they will roll. So one can see that the 10 Allied fighters will roll 30 air-to-air dice. Those 2 bombers roll 1 die each, so they contribute 2. So the Axis max out their air-to-air dice at 32, and you can follow those across for the air-to-ground, ground-to-air. The 20 and 14, they max out that. On the ground attack in the green box, you can see that they've got 24 and 8, so they've already maxed out the 30. So one can be, I wouldn't say sloppy, but when you have so many units, as long as you hit that 30, it should be good. The one thing to keep track of are your tanks. Once you get those large number of dice, you might as well put the tanks in the defensive mode and protect them, because it takes 3 dice, 3 hits to kill those tanks in that row. So when you're, at least what we're learning is that when you're in those bigger battles, you might as well protect the tanks. You got enough dice to hit the 30 unit. On the Axis side, the one thing I would point out is that they didn't max out on the ground. They hit 28 in the green area. The movement of 2 artillery from an anti-air stance to a ground stance would have resulted in a total of 30 ground dice and would not have affected the anti-air portion and air combat portion of the battle. I think the point could also be made, why not shift some of the fighters to a ground stance, since there are 14 artillery ground-to-air dice, but they would probably be the first casualties taken in an air war, so that they wouldn't be able to attack the ground forces. So I think in this case, it's better to shift the artillery, because they're immune from losses in the air battle. Now let's take a look at the casualties on both sides. I don't have the actual die rolls that occurred, but these are the casualties that resulted from the battle. The Allies took 18 hits in total, 12 air, 6 ground. The Axis took 16 casualties, 11 ground, and 5 air. Given the slight advantage that the Allies had in terms of 2 dice, one might say, or look at this, and it looks like the Axis actually did pretty good. The casualty rate on both sides was 49 and 50%, so very similar. But if one looks at the air versus ground casualty rate, the Allies took a much higher 57% ground casualty rate and a lower 38% air casualty rate versus a 50-50 split on the Axis. So the Allies came out ahead in the air war, and that has some significance because those are more expensive units and technically more powerful. Correspondingly, the Allied total OSR loss was 86 and the Axis 82. So a pretty even battle overall, I would say. And I think what we're going to see in the game is when you have these giant stacks and both sides are rolling 30 air dice and 30 land dice, I think we're going to see balanced outcomes, that there's enough dice being rolled, that it's probably going to be, a pretty even balance, and that, as we'll see in the survivor list, it may not be the battle losses that affect who wins and loses, but who can resupply the battle more easily, who has reinforcements to bring in for the next battle, so that these 30, 60 roll battles become battle of attrition, and in the end, the group that can't resupply their battle will be the ones that lose. Now let's take a look at the surviving units after the battle. The Allies ended up with 19 total units, so 9 ground, 10 air, and those totaled 125 OSRs. The Axis ended up with 16 units, 11 ground and 5 air, for a total of 84 OSR units. So one can see that while the balance is not too far off, 19 versus 16, the ratio of powerful air units to ground units is lower on the Axis side. So starting off the next turn battle, they would already be at a slight disadvantage. But if one looks at the map at the time, one will also see that the Russians could more easily reinforce Bryansk, bringing in the 14th, bringing in a stack of artillery and 1 infantry that we're going to build next turn, and bringing in the 13th Air. The other factor here that led the Axis to capitulate was that the fact that there weren't many reinforcements available to the Germans. They would have to still fight through Russian-controlled territories, taking losses, or they're just too far away to get there in time. And at this point, the Luftwaffe was pretty much destroyed. And finally, you can see up in A3, there were American fighters not far behind, able to land at the end of this turn. One final thing to note on the casualties is that the Germans chose air units as casualties. Typically, one would choose the air units assigned to the upcoming ground attack as casualties. So that's one thing to point out here. Ideally, it would have been better to take the hits against the 13th, the British 13th Air. But in this case, there were so many dice. There were over 30 anyway in all the cases that those hits probably wouldn't have made any difference anyway. But in a smaller battle, taking the ground fighters out would be the best move. Okay, one final thought before we go to the conclusion and wrap up is stress. There were only Germans in this battle, but if there had been Italians or Japanese, one should also consider which enemy forces to take and what impact it has upon stress, because perhaps on the homeland status track, it might throw one of the countries into the next level. So that could be that they don't get the three resources, that they don't get to use rail, or so on and so forth on that circular homeland status track. So that's another thing to keep into account when you're choosing casualties. So actually, after we played this game and it wrapped up, I thought, can I look at what happened from an economic dice unit standpoint? And my intentions weren't to do a video, but I started putting everything into a spreadsheet and realized there might be something here of interest. So I'll just conclude here, but please let me know if you found this interesting. I'm taking notes on future battles. I'll probably do this for myself. Maybe not into this level of detail. First time, just kind of want to show the charts and tables and maybe get myself and you familiar with those tables. Let me know if it's useful. I'll probably do some more of these for myself, and I could do a video on them as well. So in conclusion, behind the battle for Bryansk, what did I take away from this and kind of the data we've covered is that how does the 30 dice limit affect choices in the game in terms of quantity and quality of units to bring into a battle. It's not really like Axis and Allies where you get unlimited dice. You bring in as many units and you crush them through pure numbers. There might be a little more finesse in War Room in terms of the mix of units that you bring in, how you place them on the battle board, what casualties do you force upon your opponent. Do you take units that, like for instance, the air units that are set up to attack the ground units? Probably take those first so that perhaps they roll fewer ground dice in the ground battle. Um, and I'm sure there's going to be other nuances that come into play here. Where do you keep reinforcements? Or do you just bring in an overwhelming force and whittle it down eventually? The other thing to take into consideration are the commands, those top units that control the stacks. How many of those are there? Maybe you can't keep units spread out. Maybe you can't keep things as reinforcements. Maybe they do have to be 8-unit stacks. So I think we're going to see a lot more things to consider in that sense. Um, Again, it has some Axis and Ally similarities, but I think the battle's so different in terms of the 30 dice limit that there'll be a lot more, like I said, finesse in terms of the battles. Please let me know your thoughts, and curious to see how future battles go and how other people's experiences are with the game. Take care.